Good evening and welcome to Cooperative Vermont. I'm Matt Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
We're coming to you live from VCAM Studios this Sunday, February 23rd, 2014. And we've got a few different topics we'll be hitting on tonight. We'll be doing some local news. We'll be talking about the big National Credit Union Conference that's about to kick off in Washington, D.C. And then we'll be going over some of the details of the trip I'll be taking starting tomorrow across the South, doing some oral histories related to the credit union movement. So, it should all be interesting. But first, the news.
Yeah, so some pretty big news out of Burlington this past week or so. The BT settlement is moving ahead, and looks like there'll be the organizing picking up around the Keep BT Local effort, and we got some footage from Alan Matson of that board.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I was able to go sit down with him, and we've got and ask him a few questions about what the next steps are. So check that out, and we'll be back shortly.
I think that the announcement last week from the city of a proposed settlement with city capital is a great move forward. It really allows the co-op now to move the conversation from kind of, well, what happens if the litigation gets settled, to, okay, now that this is settled, we can go talk to financiers and say, really, this is what it's worth. This is what is there in our network. And it's changed the conversation that we can now have with both members and the community. Other great things that we see right now is they've put a timeline out there, but it's fairly long. It looks like they've structured this transaction to get some interim financing that gives the city a good 2 to 3 year window to get a good transaction done. So the co-op is really revitalizing its efforts right now to get folks engaged as well as to get potential financiers engaged. But it's not as if we have to have something done by June. In fact, I think the city will probably only finish up all of their dealings in the transaction around the summer. So as that occurs, we're going to be getting out, talking to members, talking to financing people. Again, as I said, to revitalize this so that we can really have a good shot at keeping this very important asset in the city under local control. Other things that are going on these days, you've got major deals going on with Comcast, purchasing Time Warner Cable, which was announced today. And it just stresses the need we have for, I think, local control, because net neutrality, the implications of that ruling recently are going to be potentially very costly if there is not some kind of local control that can keep the local network open to all sorts of traffic coming in from the outside.
And for members who are interested in getting involved in this kind of upcoming stuff, what sorts of opportunities do you envision there being?
Yeah, I think there's one. Keep your eyes open. We will get out to people. We're starting to revitalize through the steering committee in a meeting in about the next 2 to 3 weeks. And after that meeting, I think we're going to really have some marching orders to go out. There's going to be, I think, more of a focus to put together, again, go after member recruitment. And we're going to have some work on the publicizing front, and also have the chance to go out and look for additional financing. So both members, as they look to perhaps commit to the co-op, or if there are people in the community who are saying, geez, we would really like to have a bigger say or a bigger role in this, they should come to the co-op and hear how we see the potential for this going forward. Likewise, I think communities surrounding Burlington might now well have the opportunity to be served by Burlington Telecom. It won't come tomorrow, but this potentially, if the Public Service Board, who has to weigh in on this transaction, makes certain type of statements, it really could open that up to all of our local communities. As I said, it won't happen immediately, but over the next couple of years, could give the South Burlington, could give Winooski, could give Colchester, could give Shelburne the opportunity to have real competition to the major providers like Comcast.
And now that the game is kind of afoot in terms of the settlement details are there, what do you see as the kind of other players that might be moving in to sort of compete with the co-op?
I think that there'll be more like regional type telecom parties who may be interested in this. I think right now the largest players probably won't have much of an interest, but there are regional telecoms in upstate New York, one of whom's recently made a purchase locally of a company called Teljet. You've got VTEL in other parts of the state. I think these are parties who might also look at this as an opportunity to expand their footprint, but not necessarily with the local focus in mind.
Awesome. Any final thoughts?
I think it's very important that we keep BT local. I think that's the punchline.
So that was, just a quick sit down with Alan Matson of the Keep BT Local Board, and so it seems like there's still a fairly generous timeline in terms of the necessary laying the necessary groundwork for hopefully keeping local control of the telecom. But the next sort of big event is there's going to be, I believe, a gathering of the steering committee, sort of the kind of a broader group to talk about what sort of organizing efforts they want to do next. Starting, I believe, on the 6th of March.
Yep. Yeah, it's nice to see some clarity around the sort of Burlington Telecom as an asset and how that's going to play out in terms of the city moving ahead with plans to sell it to someone. It seems like a cooperative is a great way to do it because the city has invested public money into this resource, and a cooperative structure allows the organization to be run for sort of the mutual benefit of all members, and that's something you lose when you sort of bring in a private entity that's going to use that subsidy essentially of the public investment to generate profit. It's going to be exciting to follow the story.
Yeah,
going forward.
It seems like one of the biggest challenges will be just sort of kind of coming up with the necessary amount of capital to make that kind of serious bid. But that's really the work that the board, according to Alan and others who I've talked to, have been really putting the time into, sort of trying to track down that money. And also, on top of the amount that the members are going to be putting in, kind of as an initial investment. Right. But yeah, we'll definitely continue covering the story as it develops over the course of the next few months, and any events that kind of come out of that. But in terms of co-op startups, one of the ones we've been following for a while that's been very inspirational to me has been Granite City Grocery. And in terms of that kind of member organization building community events, they've been doing a great job with that, kind of having presence at a lot of different community events. So if anyone's interested in kind of getting a sense of what's going on, they're having one that's coming up that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, March 14th, I believe, and it's going to be a blues bash, sort of hosted at a local establishment, and it just seems like such a fun way to sort of build energy around that endeavor.
And it's one of those things where it's where these co-op startups really run on volunteer labor, but there's still definitely a need for some funds. So they're
right.
charging a small cover, and it's a way of building community and recruiting new members. They're doing it at the Elks Club right downtown. So if anyone out there is interested in checking it out, it's again the 14th, starting at 7:30 p.m. And it's $5 for members of the co-op and $10 for non-members, with all the proceeds going to sort of feed back into the organizing efforts. And again, if they're successful at this and they can get a downtown grocery store in Barrie, that's going to be a huge coup, for the whole community there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then another positive note of co-op movement growth is the VSECU's St. Johnsbury branch. VSECU is the only credit union in Vermont that has the kind of whole charter for the whole state. So it seems like they've been pretty consistently having new branches pop up in a lot of the smaller towns as of late. Right,
and that's great. The more folks that have access to cooperative financial services, definitely better.
And that neck of the woods, Northeast Kingdom, has sort of seen a decline in access lately. There was one credit union that went under specifically because of fraud I believe on the part of its manager, who's set to be sentenced for that in mid-April, I believe. So we'll be definitely covering that case, but it's good to sort of see that hasn't, just left a hole. The other cooperative financial institutions are moving to fill that hole.
Absolutely, yeah.
But any other local things before we move on to the GAC?
Shall we provide an update on the steering committee?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So the steering committee of, I guess, do we have a name yet? Because that was one of the items up for discussion.
Technically, at the moment, we decided it's Cooperative Vermont, although
Okay.
we'll be engaging in the process to figure that out.
The entity that's currently going by Cooperative Vermont, or non-entity, whatever. We had our second steering committee meeting this past Saturday. There are 5 folks that participated in the meeting, and it was generally a really good discussion. The one thing that struck me about these meetings to date is there's been a really deliberate effort to proceed in a way that's maybe slower initially, but in a way that we're sort of making sure that we're capturing everyone's input and sort of broadening that base, making sure we're really meeting the needs of cooperators in Vermont. So it was a very good meeting.
Yeah, it was kind of a few. The long-term goal of this steering committee is really to bring together some sort of umbrella, sort of cross-sector cooperative organization for the state. A few other places kind of have this going on right now. The Philadelphia area has the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance. In Austin they have they have kind of a network. There are some states that have cooperative councils. So this is not an entirely new thing, but so a few pieces that are kind of interesting. One is there's kind of a second subcommittee related to the steering committee, but kind of doing its own work. That's responsible for starting to put on regular events that are kind of both a social and educational nature. And we decided that we would aim to have the first event in April, and tentatively saying we're going to try to do it in Barre.
Cool.
And the idea will be there will be a few elements to it. One is that each event will be themed after a cooperative principle. So we'll start off probably with cooperation among cooperatives to kick it off, and do education, member economic participation. Just kind of go down the list as a way of kind of spreading the word about this, but also sort of really touring around the state, because for better or for worse, a lot of the organizing has been happening in the Burlington area, since that's been kind of where where we've been and sort of the base of that. So part of the idea is, I think, of this is to really have it be a road show, sort of a tour that can go around the state and really sort of build the network in other places. So try to go down to the Connecticut River Valley and Bennington and up into the Northeast Kingdom, and do these. And obviously, like, one of the problems, of course, in that whole deal is transportation. So we were discussing one way of trying to mitigate that problem and really get cooperators from different parts of the state to meet each other would be to maybe try to see if we could get sponsorship at each event for the co-op. Maybe sponsors a van from its area, so that interested cooperators from that area can attend the event kind of together without having to all drive, and really sort of make it as easy as possible for folks to sort of come together for these things. And we're going to try to have at least one sort of speaker on some topic at each one, generally hopefully connected to the theme of the particular meeting.
Right.
But the goal is to have them once a month, and we'll be starting in April, so that organizing's afoot.
Yeah, I was really excited by the connection to the principals with the events. It's a cool idea. I like that a lot. It sort of relates back to the Granite City story, the importance of having these events to build sort of an identity around the effort. So it's exciting.
Yeah, and then sort of the other piece of the steering committee meeting, that was kind of a report back from a subcommittee, but the other big piece is the continued process of trying to work out what structure we want this. If we're going to build this cross-sector cooperative network, what structure should it be? Mm-hmm. And we're still a ways away from kind of really nailing that down exactly, but we sort of agreed upon a process where we're going to have a bunch of people all go out and look at different models that groups are using, both here in the United States, maybe even in other countries. Look at the way they've arranged themselves, how the power is distributed, what are pros and cons of approaching it in different ways, mm-hmm. and then we can kind of come to the group and say, hey, here's some options, here's some, let's take all these different pieces and see what we can develop. So, we're at the very beginning of that. We're going to be actually looking for volunteers to sort of do research on individual models. So if anyone out there who's watching and would like to participate in that process, we'd really appreciate whatever help folks could give. And I think it will be an interesting project to really dig in and see how different groups of cooperators have solved this problem in different places in the past. We don't have to completely reinvent the wheel.
Right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that information distills.
So the next steering committee meeting is in 2 weeks, scheduled for, again, a Saturday morning. And if any folks are interested and want to get involved in that, you can leave a comment on the Facebook page, which is, if you just search for Cooperative Vermont, you can find it there. You can also we have a Twitter account, and there's a bunch of ways of connecting with us. But if you want to get on there, we'll add you to the Google list, and you can have your input, which would be definitely helpful. But we'll be continuing to bring updates from those steering committee meetings as the story progresses.
Excellent.
But so now, another sort of on the national front, a kind of big of a yearly event is about to happen. Starting to see on social media people posting pictures, and they're all arriving in DC. It's the GAC, or as and probably I'm the only one who does this, like to call it the GAC, in reference, of course, to Nickelodeon and the gooey, sticky stuff. But yeah, so what is the GAC? Tell you went to it last year, so I want to kind of get a sense of what's the purpose, what's the community like, what are the different opportunities that people have, who shows up?
Sure. It's the Governmental Affairs Conference, and this conference is sort of put on by CUNA, the Credit Union National Association, and it's really the credit union conference of the year. There's typically several thousand credit union volunteers and professionals that sort of descend on DC for this week, and the first couple days of the conference focus on education through sort of workshops, and also a lot of speeches that different elected officials come and speak to the conference. That part gets a little old because there's a lot of them. But the coolest part is just being among all of these folks that have dedicated themselves to the credit union movement. That's by far the coolest part, and you're surrounded by thousands of them. Mm-hmm. And there were some great workshops too. I attended the Cooperation Amongst Cooperatives workshop last year that Mike Beal was a panelist for. He's the head of the National Cooperative Business Association, and Adam Schwartz, really cool co-op guy. So there's some good workshops around sort of the political rhetoric, and then the later half of the week is really where the sort of the rubber meets the road, where the volunteers, all the credit union volunteers, go and sort of meet their elected officials and talk to them about issues facing credit unions and credit union members. And the other very interesting part is that at least the Vermont contingent, did this last year all together. So you have, folks representing whole host of different credit unions sort of uniting in this effort, which is really cool.
And so how does it's obviously in DC, so you've got this educational aspect to it. How does the sort of political advocacy piece sort of play in? Is that kind of heavily sort of organized by the National Association, or is that kind of more of a, like, each state does its own thing because it has its own delegation, or what does that look like?
No, it's pretty it's organized by the Credit Union National Association, where a significant portion of the agenda is elected officials coming in to speak to the conference as a whole. So everyone's there together. And there's a wide range of folks that touch on different issues. I personally enjoyed it when someone would start off the speech by saying, "I'm a credit union member," and you sort of have this connection with them at that point. But it's pretty cool. There's a lot of higher. There's a lot of pretty powerful people in the room. Like John Boehner gave one of the keynote speeches last year.
Mm-hmm. And so, as with any conference, you have the sort of official agenda, and then there's lots of kind of unofficial things, like networking and parties, and what is the sort of the kind of like outside of the agenda kind of culture of the event? What's that like? Yeah,
so it's interesting that you had asked in the previous question, is this organized by the National Association or by different states? The official program is very much National Association, but outside of the official program, there's a lot of programming, at least in sort of the perspective that I had. Vermont Credit Unions, the Association of Vermont Credit Unions, does a lot of organizing around organizing all the folks that are down from Vermont and going out to dinner. With CUNA economists one night, and it really built sort of a camaraderie and got to know other folks in the movement in the state. So I guess the official program is sort of built towards the whole audience, but then there are these subparts where you really get to know your sort of local credit unionists a little better.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine, as with a lot of conferences, there's like vendor areas and things like that. What are the roles of the vendors in the space?
Yeah, there's a massive exhibit hall and vendors exhibiting all sorts of things, mainly around credit union services. So like payroll providers and technology folks, things of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was down at the America's Credit Union Museum on Friday to meet with Peggy Powell, who's the director there, and she was kind of in the midst of getting everything ready because they were going to be tabling at the GAC. Because I think they're in the midst of a campaign to get to build sort of a research annex onto the museum. So that, of course, requires raising money, and so going down, I imagine, that's the place to do it.
Right, yeah. So yeah, it's quite the event. A lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And is it what's the split between people who are like credit union professionals and people who are sort of the volunteers? Is it usually like a credit union? Each credit union will send like one of each, or do some credit unions send a lot and some credit unions not send anybody?
So I can sort of get at that question sort of two different ways. I think in sort of walking around the space, there seem to be more professionals than volunteers. I know I was there with Vermont Federal Credit Union, and we sent one board member, our CEO, a senior manager, and then two employees outside of sort of senior management as an educational experience. So it was pretty well spread out across the organization.
And is there any sense of, I feel like in the credit union movement, there's this sort of differentiation between large and small credit unions. Yeah, and this sort of played out recently, where State Employees Credit Union in North Carolina recently announced that it was disaffiliating both from CUNA and its state league, which was kind of big news because they're like $24 billion or something along those lines in assets, like huge institution in credit union terms, not in terms of the banking industry where you can look at trillions in assets, but
Right.
But for credit unions, big. So was there a sense of kind of a divide or like different tracks for the small credit unions versus the big credit unions, or like how did that play out?
Not at the GAC. I think CUNA does target some programming specifically to smaller credit unions. Although I'm sure it's a lot easier for larger credit unions to send their people to GAC than smaller credit unions.
Yeah, because it's we've been seeing this continuous trend of consolidation, and so the needs of the two, and there's always to a certain extent been a tension between the needs of like the large institutions and the small institutions, and how much dues should be for each, and what services the league should provide and such not.
Sure.
But you the vibe you got was kind of a sense of more unity than division on that issue at the conference.
Yeah, I would say so.
So do you have any sense of what folks are hoping will be sort of the outcome of this year's GAC? Are there any kind of big campaigns or big things that you see as they're hoping to accomplish this year?
Well, we've talked about the credit union taxation issue on this show before, and that issue really seems to be coming to a head again this week. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee plans on sort of releasing a draft proposal for tax reform, and that's where this issue has sort of come up before, and the idea that reduced tax exemptions in order to simplify the tax code and reduce tax rates sort of across the board. And last year they were talking about taking away all exemptions completely, and then sort of organizations have to fight to get that exemption put back in place. So that would, of course, credit unions as not-for-profit, democratic cooperatives that serve a social benefit of providing credit to folks of modest means in general, that would put that tax benefit in jeopardy.
Yeah, and that's been a kind of a long-running fight, both like kind of in recent terms. We've been seeing this kind of "Don't Tax My Credit Union" campaign for the last year. Mm-hmm. And do you have a sense of kind of what's your sense of in this go around? Kind of who are the major players, and is there a sense of like, is this something that people are worried is really going to happen, or like what's the relative power of each side in your estimation?
Well, I think the Bankers Association, as you mentioned, have been trying to fight this credit union taxation or credit unions tax exemption for quite some time. Interestingly enough, it was sort of at last GAC that CUNA started organizing around the "Don't Tax My Credit Union" campaign, and they put a lot of energy into that over the past year. It's recently sort of they've been focusing on it less, as the possibility of tax reform has sort of also fallen out of the news. So I think I would say that the National Association is pretty happy with the amount of organizing that they've had around this effort, and are hoping that it'll pay off in whatever comes out of the committee.
Mm-hmm. This is one of those interesting issues that I geek out on credit union history a bunch, and I've been sort of digging further and further into the origins of this fight, and it goes back a ways. I was actually reading I have a big shelf full of copies of the old credit union bridge from like the 1930s to the 1960s, which was the kind of like movement journal of record. And so
that's really cool.
For another sort of project that I was looking for some information on, I read like the 1956 and half of 1957 issues yesterday, And I came across some really interesting stuff. I didn't find what I was looking for. I was looking for references to the Montgomery bus boycott, because the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization that kind of was the sort of steering committee for the bus boycott, had a credit union committee and was attempting to form a credit union sort of at that time. I didn't find anything on that, but I did find some really interesting references to kind of the fight over credit union taxation, and specifically an organization that I'd never heard of before, but it was the National Tax Equity Association. And there's actually even sort of a scathing overview of what they were trying to do in 1957. So I'm going to try to look at some of the other years to see of where this fight kind of flared up. I guess 1951 was a big year for that, because that's when mutual savings banks lost their tax exemption.
Right.
But so I dug into that, and I found some info there, and then I put it in Google, and I found very, very few hits came up for National Tax Equity Association. There's kind of a couple books and pamphlets that were kind of anti-credit union and more generally cooperative tax exemption. But I did find one really interesting master or PhD dissertation from Columbia University from 2012 that was really an overview of kind of the rise and fall of the cooperative, not complete fall, it still exists as the National Cooperative Business Association, but by the 1960s it really sort of was only had a shadow of the clout that it had in the 30s and 40s. But this kind of trajectory of the organized cooperative movement. And it turns out the National Tax Equity Association was founded during World War II by sort of for-profit companies in a number of sectors who faced competition from cooperatives, and it became kind of the front group for sort of pushing against their tax exemption. And really, I found an article from one of the people who was heavily involved in it, kind of as a lawyer and economist. And their argument, going back to the 40s again, was really that essentially cooperatives said the argument for the tax exemption is that the cooperative is a pass-through. It's the consumer owns it and then gets that money back. So really, it's sort of like a delayed price reduction. And sort of this article from him was arguing that no, it's not. It's the same, and that it should be taxed the same way, despite the different ownership structure. And so they kind of had a series of, according to the Credit Union National Association thing, they'd had their original president, I guess, resigned in the 1940s, and they sort of had up and down political influence. But it really sort of goes to show that this was, the credit union piece was only one part of it. It was a larger campaign against cooperatives generally. And so we kind of have this continuity going all the way back to this fight that really got raging in the 40s. Although even I was also looking through, and Roy Bergengren, who was one of the founders of the credit union movement, in his first book from, I believe, 1923, he mentions that there's a pamphlet that had been written that argued against credit union tax exemption then. So this is a perennial fight that's gone on, from sort of generation to generation. It keeps coming up, and we're, the folks who are doing the hashtag no tax or don't tax Tuesdays, and telling their legislators don't tax my credit union, are fighting the same fight that their grandparents and their great-grandparents fought back in the day.
Right. And I think you hit on an important point there with the structure and the mutual common ownership. It means that all the profits need to stay within the institution for the mutual benefit of all those members. Whereas with a for-profit structure, those profits can be privatized and sent off to shareholders. So I mean, there's an important distinction there that anything that the organization, anything above expenses, that stays within the organization for the benefit of the members. And the other important thing to sort of keep in mind, I think, is a popular refrain is, for-profit companies are also democratic because their shareholders can vote. And of course, that's not democracy because one person can have as many votes as they have shareholders.
As plutocracy.
Right.
Ruled by money.
Right. So there are some pretty important distinctions there. And credit unions were founded on a social purpose as well, to provide credit to people of modest means. And we've seen this with sort of cooperatives of all sectors. The electric cooperatives are a good example. For-profit companies just stopped putting line out to people where it didn't make any economic sense for them to do so. Mm-hmm. So the electric co-op had to step in and do that for the people of the area together. And certainly if credit unions didn't exist, there would be people that for-profit banks may not have a particular interest in serving because there's no money there. I mean, that's what guides for-profit companies' decision.
Right. I actually got into a really interesting discussion with someone maybe a week or two ago, kind of about sort of the origins of that and sort of when the really because in a lot of those earlier fights, it wasn't the commercial banks weren't the ones who were really sort of at the forefront, because they weren't the ones at that time who were really sort of in direct competition with the credit unions. Like in the 20s, it was like installment, like kind of loan shark companies.
Yep.
And in the 40s, it was, again, part of this larger campaign in which a lot of the funding for the organization came from the agricultural sector, from, say, processors who resented having competition with cooperative processors. One of the first founders of the organization owned a cotton gin, and he faced competition from cooperatively owned cotton gins, and he didn't like that. So, talk about an unsympathetic character.
Right.
Exploit. I want to exploit the sharecroppers harder.
Yeah.
But so there's this kind of transition. It seems like in the 50s and 60s, really, when the larger banks finally started to see people of modest means as a viable market for them. Mm-hmm. And I think in this conversation, one thing that really came out of it was a big part of that was the development of credit scores, in the sense of, okay, like now you can have this like quasi-objective measure that you can use to sort of set someone's interest rate and measure their risk. Whereas before, it was really like you would have to have some decently reliable social knowledge of a person's condition and position and sort of reliability. And you could only really do that by being embedded in the community, whether that was as a community banker or as like a credit union's credit committee or something like that. Mm-hmm. But like you couldn't be sitting in an office thousands of miles away making that decision because you simply didn't have enough adequate knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's sort of interesting to see that even though this fight has continued, it just depend. It's the actual opponent of the credit union movement has changed in terms of who is in direct competition. What for-profit sector is tussling with the not-for-profit credit union sector over market share.
Right. And as credit unionists and sitting here defending the tax exemption, which is really important, I think there's also a duty to make sure that credit unions are held to being democratic and serving their members, sort of staying true to their roots as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because one of the arguments that the ABA, I read an article by American Bankers Association, read an article by one of their economists who was making the argument that a lot of the benefits and the gains from increased scale have been captured by the management of credit unions rather than by the members. And it's like, and while I think it's important to not sort of simply brush off those sorts of critiques because the person who's making them this has like an underlying agenda of wanting to destroy the cooperative movement, which they tend to do.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think it's sort of there is a piece of a sort of kernel of truth in that, really the credit union movement does need to kind of make sure that it's really thinking about democracy and member empowerment, and coming back to really sort of always being vigilant about the question of like, are we really serving the members? Are we really doing this at the highest capacity that we can?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, But since this issue is coming up now, and you said it's kind of coming up in a committee, and is it in the House or?
Yeah, the House Ways and Means Committee. Yeah, so they're going to put out some guidance or a draft proposal for tax reform this week sometime.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what's in there as far as the credit union tax exemption, but it's also. I think CUNA estimates they'll have 4,300 people in Washington this week, and most of those people will go knocking on the doors of their representatives and speaking to them about these issues. So it's pretty good timing in that sense.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty solid projection of political power.
Yeah. And those 4,300 people represent 96 million more. So there's a lot of stories out there to be told.
Yeah, and if you're out there and you're a credit union member and want to lend your voice to this fight, this week will be will be a great time to just add to the pile. Whether you're sending an email or a phone call or a tweet to your congressional representative, this is a good moment to do it.
Yeah, and just one other thing that I want to touch on before we leave this subject is and other issues that are sort of percolating up was I'm sure that our delegation will be talking to our representatives about member business lending and raising sort of the arbitrary cap that's imposed on credit unions. That at this point, credit unions can provide competition in the marketplace for business loans, and some of our larger credit unions are really getting quite close to that cap, which takes competitors out of the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And so that's an important, that'll really make a difference to consumers.
And it would be a great compromise position on that. Would be exemption for loans to other cooperative organizations.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Ideally, just lift the cap entirely.
Yeah,
but we can dream. But yeah, also on the credit union front, though, I've got my my trip through the South coming up. So that was kind of the impetus for me reading all of those 1950s trade magazines.
That's cool. That's cool. So yeah, this sounds like a really exciting trip. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
So basically, I'm going to be flying down to New Orleans, and my goal is to collect a whole bunch of oral history interviews from elderly African-American credit union people. So people who were active in the movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And there's a bunch of stuff I feel like I want to learn, because I've been doing a lot of research on the history of the credit union movement. But there's this huge gap in that most of that history is based on these kind of written records that have survived. Mm-hmm. And those written records tend to be kind of, produced by people who had high status in the movement. They were, the editor of, say, the Credit Union Bridge, which was the publication of CUNA, or they were, the head of the state league, or, and they were putting their newsletter out.
Right.
So the vast majority of material that's available kind of comes from those sources. And what that has kind of meant is that the story of the credit union movement has tended to be the story of those sort of high-status people who tended to be more white, more male, really sort of reflecting the power dynamics of their time. And so my hope is that by interviewing a good cross-section of African-American credit union people, mostly from across the South, although I've got at least one interview lined up in New York City as well.
Cool.
To sort of provide this new body of sources that people who are interested in the history of credit unions can consult when looking at, okay, well, what was the African-American experience? And there's a lot of questions that really, I've been hard-pressed to find answers to. Like, for instance, especially in the South, how did the culture and sort of institutional segregation play out in the credit union movement? Mm-hmm. Really, the only reference I found is in a history of the Virginia Credit Union League, which talks about in the 50s, sort of there having been this tension around the league. There were, majority black credit unions, and the league sort of having all members participate in the sort of annual meeting, but having segregated or just whites only sort of social events and all the the sort of dinner banquet and that sort of thing was whites only, even though the African Americans could participate in the actual governance meeting. But that's really the only reference I've been able to find to, and it was sort of, that was in reference to 1959 being the first year that sort of segregation stopped happening. But I want to sort of hear from other folks about from their perspective, how did that play out? Was the credit union movement ahead of the curve? Were in different places, did it play out differently? And how did change happen? And also sort of kind of related to that, the connection to the civil rights movement. Because when I found out that, when I really sort of dug into the sort of Martin Luther King support for credit unions and the attempts by the Montgomery Improvement Association to form a credit union in 1957 and again in 1959, and having their application rejected both times, sort of looking at, okay, well, this definitely inspired other folks in the civil rights movement to embrace credit unionism, and you had this growth in the 70s and 80s of credit unions organized through black churches, which were sort of one of the foundational institutions of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Really, how things got organized was through the churches. So I want to kind of look at that, and then there's also sort of something that Jeff Hardin cued me in on in North Carolina, which is as the regulatory system got more intense, especially after the establishment of the National Credit Union Administration and share insurance. Mm-hmm. One of the big trends was that I think that I've come to the conclusion that share insurance was one of the largest drivers of the consolidation of the credit union movement. And the NCUA tended to sort of treat sort of marginal credit unions, or what it perceived to be marginal credit unions, as something to sort of be gotten rid of and just be merged into larger institutions. And according to Jeff Hardin, and I'm hoping to interview one of these fellows in North Carolina, there's a guy who just sort of went back and forth across the state filing lawsuits against the NCUA to protect black credit unions from just being swallowed up. And I think it's something that you can kind of see in the regulatory system, where you have this incentive of regulators to regulate a few large institutions rather than many small institutions. And because the large institutions tend to both, you have less work, but also the people who run it tend to be more professional, more sort of peers of the regulators, rather than having the regulator sort of be supporting people who are amateur, semi-professional, running much smaller institutions. Yeah. And then you could have that extra layer of, you add a little bit of subtle racism to the mix, and sort of, you could easily see the regulatory structure in the NCUA in the 70s and 80s as being a real sort of oppressive force, kind of retarding the development of the African American credit union movement. So I want to sort of investigate that. There's a lot of things that I think could be the case, but there's really little written on it. So I'm hoping from these stories that I'll collect that it'll shed a lot of light on the African American experience, and also just how did people learn about credit unions? What were their motivations to get them started? What impacts did they have? What was the material impact on their communities?
That's really cool. There's a lot to dig into there. I imagine you'll be sort of encountering a lot of volunteers who put a lot of effort into this, into building the credit union movement, through really grassroots and organizing and energy. Mm-hmm. And potentially, there's a lot of texture there to, provide to that story of credit unions in the South. So that should be really cool. Yeah,
and I'm still in the process of finalizing my list of interviewees, and we'll probably be continuing to develop it as I'm on the road on the fly. But I just got off the phone with the sort of head of the history committee of the African American Credit Union Coalition. And she was telling me about this one fellow in Mississippi who I'm really excited to meet, who's 91 years old and and is still involved in his credit union, still as a volunteer, and in the entire 50 plus years that he's been involved, it has been as a volunteer. So just to be able to sit down and hear his story and ask him these questions and get his insight and wisdom about what's the meaning of the credit union movement? How has it changed? What drives someone to sort of be in that role for decade after decade and sort of see this as their service to the world, more or less.
Right.
And so, I think the stories will be really interesting, and I'm gonna, just bring my little video camera, set it on the table, and go for probably I'm gonna aim for 1 to 2 hour interviews with folks, long enough to really sort of develop a rapport and kind of get into the nitty gritty and ask the serious questions, but not so long that folks get exhausted and burned out either. And my goal will be to really sort of have a quick turnaround time on at least the fairly raw on it, limit with very little editing. So basically, shoot the video, do some light editing, make sure the audio is good, all that, and then upload it within a day or two, and throw up a blog post on credit union history.
That's awesome. So we'll be able to follow your progress from the road. Cool.
Yep.
Cool.
I was actually even just thinking of I'll probably use the Cooperative Vermont YouTube channel and just pop things up as I go.
Yeah.
So if folks out there are subscribed to it, just go on YouTube, look for Cooperative Vermont. You can find all our old episodes, and you'll be able to soon find, hopefully, a bunch of oral history interviews.
That's cool. That's really cool. What's the logistics of your trip going to look like? What areas are you planning on hitting?
So I'm flying into New Orleans, and then spending a few days there, sort of for vacation, because it's my partner's her February break set from teaching school. So nice. We'll have a few days of just enjoying the city, because neither of us have ever been there before, and then it'll be probably we'll rent a car. She'll fly back to Vermont, and then I'll rent a car, and then kind of go spend a couple more days in Louisiana, and then go from Louisiana to Mississippi. Probably a day in Mississippi, and then the folks at the Alabama League have been especially amazingly helpful, and so I've got a bunch of leads there. So I could probably spend maybe 2 days in Alabama, and then I'll roll up to probably spend 2 days in Georgia, then turn in my rental car. Take a bus up to Chattanooga, where I've got a friend whose place I can stay at, plus I've got some leads on some interviews there. And then North Carolina, where Jeff Harden with the Carolinas League has been very interested in the topic of African American history for a while. So he's done some groundwork already. So he's
cool.
A great source of sources.
Yeah.
Then up through Virginia. There's one credit union I'm particularly interested. There's probably a few interviews that are going to come out of this, but they're an African American credit union that's a Catholic parish credit union, because in the segregation era, there was for Black Catholics in D.C., church was established in Arlington, Virginia, and so the credit union is the sort of credit union for that Black Catholic church. And they're I think about to hit their 50th anniversary of the establishment of the credit union. So their treasurer was pretty excited to get in touch that this project was happening. So he's reached out and I think has had some communications with some of the founders. So I think I should get a number of interviews on that one.
Cool.
And then sort of be around there. I've got some family in that area, so I'll also spend a little time visiting them. And then the last stop before I come back to Vermont will be New York City, where there's an 81 or 82-year-old man who was referred to me, whose father was the founder who's been very involved in credit unions, but his father was the founder of the first Black credit union in New York, and who was actually an associate of Marcus Garvey, who was an early, African American leader, kind of very much sort of a forerunner of the kind of Black nationalist school of thought in many ways. He supported a lot of kind of Pan-Africanism, sort of developing a connection between the Black community in the United States and sort of in Africa.
Right.
And was also very into the sort of whole kind of building African American economic development, sort of the economic development of African American communities. So I think that it'll be interesting to sort of talk to him a little bit about the connection between that and the formation of this kind of, I think it was progressive credit union in New York, and then I'll hop on a train or bus and be back in Burlington, hopefully in time for our next show.
Awesome. Be really interested to see, how. I imagine that a lot of these credit unions have really strong ties to their founding members, and how that plays out to date.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also one of those things where, like, I think you can see in the African American credit union movement a little bit more of because it was connected to the civil rights movement, that it still has a lot more of that kind of populist mode of credit unionism that has been, I think, kind of absorbed and sort of quieted in a lot of the rest of the credit union movement. As the merger movement has happened, and
right.
We've had bigger, more professionalized credit unions, I think that that there's really sort of these unique institutions that there's more of them than that reflect a different way of doing credit unionism, and I think there's a lot to learn from that.
And the different cultures of their membership too. I mean, the diversity that sort of you lose through mergers is there's a downside there.
Yeah, the identity that's really lost,
right,
I think, is one of the big things, is that you kind of go from having kind of an economic institution that's seen as the economic arm of a community, the way that the community members can help each other, using the credit union is one way of doing that, to saying, okay, you have something that's cooperative, but the relationship is individual between the individual member and the credit union, not between, the members of the community.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, I think that that'll be one of those topics definitely want to touch on too. But, so it'll be a lot of, I've done raised a little bit of money via a crowdfunding site that should hopefully cover the lion's share of the transportation costs.
Nice.
And, but there'll be kind of a lot of trying to couch surf and, find the cheapest motels possible where I can't do that. And
yeah, I mean it's a huge endeavor, and it's amazing you're doing it. Really,
I'm pretty excited. It's like the sort of thing where I was like, all right, I've been doing my previous job for about 2 years, and I was ready to sort of make a leap back into this, and I was like, all right, this feels like the right project to do, so I'm very excited, and I think there'll be some good stories coming out of it.
Cool. We wish you well.
Thank you.
Looking forward to following the progress along the way, too.
Yeah, and again, if folks are out there and interested in following that progress, I'm going to try to put up a blog post. If you go to cuhistory.blogspot.com, there'll be I'll be putting up regular posts about hopefully, pretty much each interview will have a little post giving some context and telling the story around it. And then, or if you're just wanting to follow the videos, I'll be posting those on the Cooperative Vermont YouTube channel, so you can find them there. But yeah, so I think we're just about out of time. But you've been watching Cooperative Vermont. Again, if you know anyone in the Barre area in terms of upcoming events, we've got a few. On the 14th of March, there's at the Elks Club, there's the Granite City Grocery fundraiser, sort of blues bash. And then also March 6th is the coming steering committee for Keep BT Local. And if you want to find any information in between now and the next show, we should always check the Facebook page and the Twitter account, and we generally will throw up any relevant news we find on the social media sites.
Yeah, and our next show will be actually a month from now, March 23rd, and hopefully you'll be back. But if not, that just means you're having a great.
If I'm not back in person, I promise to call in.
Okay, sounds good.
And we should be having Don Kreis, who's been very involved in co-op organizing in a lot of different ways, has been involved in food co-ops, energy co-ops, and he's an attorney and is so I think the primary topic we'll be talking about is the kind of legal structure under which cooperatives operate, which will be dry to some people. I think it's fascinating. So, but in the meantime, I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Good night.